right, so thank you again for joining us this morning for the fourth iteration of Researching Refugeedom, which has become our flagship event for Breaking Barriers Refugee Week at the University of Leicester. So my name is Pascal Roussel. I'm one of the organizers of Breaking Barriers. I'm joined by two of my colleagues, Alex Palanak, who is the head of the Sanctuary Seekers Unit at the University of Leicester, who will also be one of our speakers later, and also Julie Umarova, who will be looking at making sure everything is going well in the background. So before we start and I introduce our speakers, I will just go through a few housekeeping rules. So you will not be able to unmute yourselves during this session. This is to ensure that you do not show in the recording without having given consent, but you can use the chat box, and we encourage you to use the chat box to introduce yourselves right now, to share any questions you may have or any comments. We will leave questions until the very end of the event just to make sure we can keep on time. Please be kind and respectful. As I mentioned, Julie is in the background, so if you have any issues or concerns, you can send her a private message directly using the chat box. As I mentioned, we are recording this session so that we can upload it later onto our YouTube channel for people who are not able to join us today, but you will not appear on the recording because Zoom only records the active speakers. And if you have any queries following this session, you can email sanctuary@le.ac.uk. So yes, please say hello in the chat if you haven't done so yet. It's always great for us to know who is in the audience, and particularly for our speakers who will be addressing you in a minute. And here are our four speakers for today. So we will start with Dr. Gabi Witthaus from UCL and the University of Birmingham. Then we will move on to a presentation by Deirdre McKenna from University of Leeds and Alex Palanak from Leicester, who I've already mentioned. And finally, we will have Dr. Kula Aritunos from the Open University. But as I've mentioned, we will start with Gabi. And Gabi, over to you now.
Thank you very much, Pascal. So I'm going to talk about how can universities support refugees to engage online as distance learners. And this is based on the research I did for my PhD, which I completed in June last year. So the research was done a few years ago, but I think it's very relevant. It's kind of timeless in a way. Just a little bit of background about the study. I investigated using the input of 10 sanctuary scholars on a program, a fully distance program run by the University of Leicester, which was an online master's in politics and international relations. I tried to understand their engagement, their learning engagement in the online program. And I think we should have the next slide then, Pascal. Thanks. So the next slide is just to set the scene that the University of Leicester was one of the front runners in setting up universities of sanctuary, making refugees feel welcome. And this was a groundbreaking program, this distance program, which has been admitting 6 refugees and asylum seekers per intake every year since 2018, and they have 2 intakes a year. So that's cumulative. They have 12 displaced people joining the program every year. So if you move on to the next slide, I'll explain a little bit about the theoretical underpinning of my study. I wanted to use a social justice approach to understanding engagement because I had a sense that, we know from the literature that refugees and asylum seekers in online programs tend to drop out, is the word that's often used, more often than other students. And retention and dropout rates are often correlated with engagement. So I got captivated by the capabilities approach, which was first put forward by the economist Amartya Sen in about 1979, and then was developed and elaborated on over the years since then. Martha Nussbaum is a philosopher and legal scholar who's written a lot about it, and her writing's really clear. I would really encourage you, if you're interested in this, to look her up. There's a great Wikipedia page on her as well. And then Melanie Walker in South Africa took these concepts into higher education. So if we go on to the next slide, I think it's going to explain the concept of capabilities. So normally when we think about capabilities, we think about personal skills and abilities that a person can develop and practice. But in the capabilities approach, capabilities include freedoms that are socially, politically, and economically enabled. That's the social justice element of it. And I wanted to know what capabilities are needed for online engagement. So if we look at the next slide, this is just to really make the concept of capabilities very concrete. So we've got a picture there of a young Black woman who's clearly very capable as a swimmer. And then juxtaposed with that is a sign from my country in a time that I grew up in 1989. This picture was taken, which very visually articulates the apartheid laws of the time. It says, City of Durban, under Section 37 of the Durban Beach Bylaws, this bathing area is reserved for the sole use of members of the white race group. So, and then it's translated into Afrikaans and isiZulu, which is the major African language spoken in that area. So even though this woman is a perfectly capable swimmer, her capabilities would have been constrained in apartheid South Africa. And that's why I think this is such a powerful framework for understanding social justice, because it looks beyond what the individual can do and says, well, if they can't do what they really would like to do and what is meaningful for them in their lives, what is stopping them? So moving on then, we're going to look at the online engagement framework. And this will be very familiar to anyone who's read about student engagement really in any context. The literature kind of falls into these 4 dimensions. Often they're subdivided into more detailed, more granular dimensions, but overall, it's agreed that there are these 4 dimensions. There's emotional engagement, behavioral engagement, social and collaborative engagement, and cognitive engagement. And I based my study on a literature review done by Patria Redmond et al. In 2018, a group of Australian academics who actually tried to find out what the literature said about online engagement. And what they found was at that time, there was very little literature available. Almost all the literature was about face-to-face, on-site, campus-based engagement. But they still found the same elements applied. However, we know from the last 25 years or so of research into online learning that social and collaborative engagement play a very important role, and those are often ignored at the point of designing online courses. And that's often where students don't complete courses or they lose interest. So if we move on, I'm going to now unpack this framework in terms of the 4 dimensions, give a brief explanation of each engagement dimension, and then talk about the constraints that the 10 displaced people in my study faced, in very short summary form, obviously. So behavioral engagement is basically sort of following the rules of the program, submitting your assignments, doing what's required of you to get that certificate at the end. The key constraint that I found, and this is not unlike for the general population, is this concept of life load, which Ella Kahu popularized, but it's been around since about the 1960s. Life load is the sum of all the pressures that a student has in their life that they have to cater for in addition to their learning. So, and especially for postgraduate students learning at a distance, those pressures will be much greater than for an undergraduate student in full-time education. So it's looking after family, it's employment, it's generally managing your life. And in the case of displaced people, this is magnified hugely because there are often huge bureaucratic constraints they have to navigate. They're often in a state of being relocated from one country to another, settling into a new place, learning how to live in a new place, all that kind of thing. So in the next slide, we can see that my key recommendation here to foster behavioural engagement for refugees and asylum seekers is to provide flexibility. This was so important. And on this particular programme, these students were actually given a lot of support by the administrative staff who had to process requests for extensions on assignments. And, they always had to fill in these mitigating circumstances forms and so on, which were sometimes a little bit re-traumatizing, because the reason that they needed extensions was because of quite traumatic stuff happening in their lives. So it's about recognizing that. And there's also a lot of literature that says quite a high proportion of the general student population suffers from trauma. And I think we're moving on to that next with emotional engagement. So let's look at that. So the emotional engagement dimension is about having positive emotions towards your learning. And in this instance, and it's often linked a lot with motivation to study. So you can imagine that the constraints for displaced people often center around trauma as well, and then associated issues such as depression and other mental health concerns. So moving on to my recommendation here. To foster emotional engagement, my key recommendation is to be trauma aware and to provide safe spaces for your students. Being trauma aware, there are others in the room who can talk more about this than me. I think Alex is probably going to mention it if I know Alex a bit later. But it's about recognizing, about avoiding asking, probing questions or direct personal questions to students that might re-trigger traumatic experiences. It's about setting up a social environment that is safe for everybody, and we'll come on to that in a bit. But the idea of the safe spaces is really important because online it's very hard to pick up any kind of cues. You don't get body language or anything, especially in this program, which was completely asynchronous. There were no Zoom sessions like this. So it does require quite a lot of thinking. Now, there's a bit of overlap with the other dimensions. So if we move on, I'll be coming back to this. Now, cognitive engagement is usually the engagement that teachers are most excited about when they see evidence of it. Because that's obviously what we're all here for at universities, right? We want students to develop intellectually, to learn critical thinking skills, to be able to articulate new knowledge, all that stuff. And the constraints in this case can be, sometimes they can be at, if we just go back to the concept of what a capability is, they can be at the personal level. It can be a skill such as learning the language, learning academic English, which we'll also hear more about in this session. And if students develop that skill, they can, overcome that constraint. But there can be other things completely outside of the students and the institution's control, such as prior experiences of hostility that students have had, where because of intersectional characteristics of, say, race, religion, ethnicity, gender identification, and so on, people censor themselves because they're anxious about the reaction that they might get from others. And I found this particularly in this context of where the content was about politics and international relations. Many of the students came from conflict-affected countries and had very, particular and very intense experiences in those countries, and had views based on those experiences that they felt were not kind of acceptable in this academic context. They it was a different worldview, and they were constantly almost like trying to play the game, figure out what was required of them. And they didn't want to experience hostility from other students as well, bearing in mind that it was quite possible that you could have two students from opposing sides in a conflict of the same country, sitting in an online course, without many people really being aware that that was the case. So if we go on to the recommendations for fostering cognitive engagement, again, it's about providing safe spaces for active inquiry. So this really leads straight into social and collaborative engagement, which is on the next slide. And as I mentioned earlier, social and collaborative engagement have been demonstrated to be critical to students' participation, engagement, and success in online learning since the early 2000s, at least. If you think of the communities of inquiry model, and there's a lot of literature around that, social presence, and so on. So often what we do, and I am guilty of this a lot. I work a lot with academics in designing online courses for distance learning. And we discuss the importance of social and collaborative engagement and how collaboratively constructing knowledge helps students learn and so on. And then we say, well, how can we make this discussion forum really interesting, engaging? What questions can we ask that are open-ended, and we'll get different students giving different views, maybe reading different papers and contributing different elements. And, so it's not just you're asking a question that's got one right answer and the first student answers it, and then all the others have to say the same thing. So we talk a lot about, how to make it really interesting. But we don't ask ourselves, well, what about the students who are unwilling to participate, to even step into that forum for fear of saying the wrong thing or being ostracized or putting something in English that doesn't, live up to what's expected of them, all the kind of the emotional anxieties they have. So you can see here also how all the different dimensions of engagement are intertwined. And thinking along those lines, on the next slide, I think I've got my recommendation for fostering social and collaborative engagement. And this is a wonderful concept, creating accountable spaces for students to learn together, that I got from a blog post by a woman in Canada called Elise Ahenkora. I've got a quote from her later, and it's in the reference list as well at the end. And she talks about the importance of setting a tone and a culture in a space where people, she's not talking specifically about education, but it works very nicely in our context as well, where people learn together, that they pay attention at the beginning and they dedicate time to agreeing on how we're going to learn together. So at the beginning of this session, Pascal, you showed that lovely slide with the housekeeping rules, and there was just a little bullet point that said, please be respectful and kind to one another, or something like that, right? Now, if we were going to, as a group, be in an online course for an extended period of time, that would be a good start. But actually spending a bit of time as a group collaboratively, and it can be done asynchronously. It doesn't have to be done in a, all online together at the same time. But how are we going to make ourselves accountable to one another? How are we going to protect each other's dignity, to actually show respect for one another, without blocking off the possibility of constructive disagreement and critical thinking? It's difficult. So that's something that often gets left out. And then in the process of delivering the course, the teacher needs to, so you've designed this really interesting question, and then you've set in motion this process for students to agree on how they're going to work together accountably. And then there still needs to be a process of, when the students are doing the activity, of checking in and modeling that kind of relationship that you want the students to have with one another, and making sure that if somebody, kind of monitoring the accountability as well. So I think moving on then. Yes, this is the quote from Elise Ahenkora. She says, to move forward, we don't need to promise safety or expect bravery. We need to embrace accountability. I slightly disagree with her. In the context of education, I think we do need to promise safety. I think we have a duty of care to our students to promise that, and that can at least be managed in the relationships between teachers and students, and then more indirectly in how you set up a culture of accountability between students. But that is the starting point, and then we're aiming towards embracing accountability. So finally, I'm going to tell you my most striking finding was that the extent to which engagement fuels engagement. So we've seen how intertwined these different kinds of engagement are, but when you actually unpick different examples of how students engaged, and you see that as soon as they overcame, one person would overcome an emotional barrier where she would say, oh no, I'm not going to engage in that discussion forum, either it's a waste of time, or all those people know so much more than me, I'm too embarrassed to participate. Once she overcame that, there would be social and collaborative engagement, and then she would learn something through that, and then there would be cognitive engagement, and throughout all of that is behavioural engagement. So it was really interesting to see how, and for me then it just said, when you're designing a course, we tend to emphasize the cognitive and behavioural engagement because that's what students get rewarded for, and that's what the certificates end up, saying at the end of the course. But if you also put some time and effort into designing for emotional and social and collaborative engagement, then, you've got a better chance of fueling all 4 types of engagement. So in conclusion, there's a final slide. These are my 4 recommendations for emotional, behavioural, social and collaborative, and cognitive engagement. I won't read them all out because I can see we're coming to the end of our time for my talk. The next slide has some references, and then there's a final slide which I think has a QR code that will take you to a version of these slides, but I think Pascal will also, or someone from Leicester will also be sending them out afterwards. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gabi. That was a really interesting talk, actually, to look at all the different aspects of engagement. So thank you. And also for mentioning our distance learning sanctuary scholarships, which we have actually recently expanded to more subjects. And we will be awarding 100 scholarships in the next 3 years. So if anyone in the room is looking for a distance learning master, I invite you to check that out later. And we can share the link to our scholarship page as well. So moving on now, I will be passing on to my colleague Alex Palanak and Deirdre McKenna. We will introduce the case study of the Refugee AP program, which you may have heard about in a previous Breaking Barriers Refugee Week. Over to you, ladies.
Thanks very much, Pascal. And Gabi, thanks very much for your presentation, which hopefully our presentation kind of picks up on some of those resonances. My name is Alex Palanak, and I'm Head of Sanctuary Seekers Unit at the University of Leicester. And as Pascal mentioned, I'm presenting today with my colleague Deirdre McKenna from the University of Leeds, and she's a lecturer in EAP. We've been working together for the past couple of years to develop the Refugee program. And so today we're going to be talking about a research project that we recently conducted looking at that program. It's a case study on the impact of it. Next slide, please. Okay, so in this presentation, we're going to cover the following. So we're going to introduce you briefly to what the Refugee program is, and then we're going to outline our study on the impact of Refugee Module 1. Then we're going to look at the key findings of that study in terms of impacts on students and also on the EAP practitioners. And then we're going to wrap up with discussion and links to literature. Next slide, please. Okay, so brief overview of the Refugee programme. So it's basically a free online pre-university academic English programme for refugee background students across the UK. We launched it in September 22, and we recruited a number of volunteer English for academic purposes tutors to run the classes, and we've been working closely with a number of partner organisations to be able to support the students on this programme. So those partner organisations are RefuAid, which is a London-based charity that provides casework support for the students. A fantastic charity called ScreenShare, which provides refurbished laptops for refugee background students who want to continue with their education. Password English language testing was also working with us to provide free entry tests onto Refugee. So in terms of the student journey onto this programme, so first of all, we recruited students, enrolled them, and they attended an induction, and then students moved on to Module 1, which is basically a 10-week group course with additional one-to-one tutor support. And then the students who got through Module 1 could then have a choice of moving on to Module 2, which was a bit more kind of tailored towards the individual students' needs. So it was 10 weeks of one-to-one mentoring and optional workshops that students could decide to go to depending on what they needed. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, in terms of the need for the refugee programme, the latest figures from the UNHCR indicate that globally 7% of forced migrants are enrolled in higher education, as opposed to 40% of non-refugee students in higher education globally. And one way in which we can help forced migrant students access education is through providing pre-sessional courses. So these courses provide academic language and skills development and can help students transition into higher education. However, these courses are often out of reach to refugee background students. There's lots of reasons for this. One of the reasons is that these courses are often too expensive for students to be able to afford. And quite often these courses are very demanding and quite intensive and inflexible. So there's lots of barriers there to negotiate. And so trying to overcome barriers to education and providing access to quality education relates to UN's Sustainable Development Goal number 4, as you can see through this diagram. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm just going to run through some of the key theoretical underpinnings of the programme. So one of the things that we incorporated into the programme is principles from connected learning pedagogical approaches. So this focuses on providing opportunities for students to learn flexibly, part-time, and to combine synchronous and asynchronous approaches. And also the opportunity to connect meaningfully with other people and to have agency in their learning. This also relates to students as partners approach, which enables students to make decisions. It gives them a bit more agency to kind of make decisions about things like syllabus content, assessment deadlines, and scheduling. So that links quite neatly with the connected learning approaches. Next slide, please. And we also incorporated a social justice ethos. So we used Hackman's 5 essential components of social justice education as a guide. So these include things like asking students to critique different perspectives, to look at a range of perspectives, to examine systems of power and inequality, and to give them choices. So you can already see how many of these concepts are kind of overlapping with some of the other principles that we just looked at. And we partly incorporated this ethos through the materials that we used on the course. So we used a book called Develop EAP, and we kind of modified that to make it trauma-informed. And the Develop EAP is a kind of open access resource that focuses on the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So we thought that that fitted really nicely with the ethos of our programme as well. And last but not least, we also based our programme on principles of trauma-informed pedagogy, which Gabi touched on in her talk. So this includes things like a careful choice of topics and activities to try to make sure as much as possible that we're not re-triggering trauma in students, setting clear expectations and offering structure, giving guidelines and negotiating guidelines from the start. But within that, offering students some choice so that they can feel a sense of agency, but also being flexible where possible. And we're going to discuss, when I hand over to Deirdre in a minute, we're going to discuss some of the key tensions that kind of came out of some of these things, that the difference between structure and flexibility. So trauma-informed approach, we kind of embedded this through training all teachers in the main principles of this approach, through modifying the materials to make sure that anything which was obviously not in line with trauma-informed pedagogy was removed. And also all of our communications through ourselves and through Julie, who's here today, she's the programme administrator for Refugeedom. We made sure that all communications were trauma-informed and sensitive. Next slide, please. Okay, so this research project was funded by Bali, and we basically conducted this research on Module 1. So, we piloted this in September 2022, and then we took insights from the first round of data collection in order to make changes to the second iteration, which ran in January 23. Next slide, please. Okay, in terms of the research question, so the research question was, what is the impact of Refugee Module 1 on both refugee background students and EAP practitioners? We decided to take a 4-stage action research approach. So we used this action research cycle, partly because historically action research has been deemed appropriate for exploring social justice issues and unequal power relations, especially when it employs kind of community participation approaches. So it seemed like a very appropriate approach for this. We ran 2 cycles of this, and we made adjustments to the programme in response to participant feedback in real time. So we had 2 main action research cycles, but also within each cycle, we made incremental changes based on that feedback that we got. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm just going to skim over this slide because I know that I'm probably running out of time. So in terms of student participants, we had 11 students who agreed to participate, 6 females and 5 males from 10 different countries. And in terms of tutor participants, we had 5. Next slide, please. So this just gives you a brief overview of the 2 main action research cycles. So as you can see, each cycle involved a planning phase where we were planning the programme, and then an act phase where we were running the programme, and then an observe and reflect phase where we collected reflective logs from students and tutors. We held focus groups with students and tutors. And then at the end of each phase, we were able to make changes to the next phase of the programme using all of that feedback. Next slide, please. Again, I'm going to skip over this slide very quickly. So in terms of data analysis, we used thematic analysis. We did, and both researchers did 2 rounds of coding of all data sets, and then we generated key themes from that. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Deirdre, who's going to talk you through some of the key themes that we found.
Thanks, Alex. Okay, so we'll start by looking at our findings based on the impact on our students. So the first theme was in facilitating the transition into HE. So all of our students, maybe not surprisingly, found that they had developed their language and academic skills from being involved in the refugee module. And they also talked about the usefulness of this for their future studies. So we've got a quote here from one of our students who mentions that they need those type of skills if they're going to study at university in the future. So the students were making that connection to their future studies. And the next slide. So as well as this, some of our students mentioned about how being on the refugee course was an opportunity for them to experience an unfamiliar academic sphere. So we've got a couple of quotes here from our students who describe it being a new world that they were not familiar with, and that it helped them to develop understanding of the expectations, so what to expect, and the chance to have the atmosphere of academic life. And our tutors also agreed that the module provided a very useful starting point to give an experience to the students of what it would be like to study full-time at a university course. And moving on to the next slide. So we'll move now to our next theme, which was about safety and confidence. So one of the most beneficial aspects that students mentioned was in how their confidence had developed. So a couple of the students talked about things like improving their confidence in speaking and feeling that they had overcome a fear of speaking in public. And they mentioned as well about how important it was in having a tutor who was understanding and patient. So for example, student 2 talked about, I've noticed improvement in confidence to speak because your teacher was patient and allowed us to speak. So yeah, so in terms of building confidence, the tutors had a very important role in that as well. And moving to the next slide. So theme 3 is a very important theme for us. It's about relationships and support. So first of all, the students talked about how they had built relationships with the peers in their group and the sense of camaraderie that they had established. So for example, student 9 described how they realized that they're not the only ones struggling with language and that the other students were in a similar position. Student 1 talked about our little group of students. And the tutors explained that they had a sense that the students were developing a strong sense of community by working on a collaborative project, which was a group essay, which also had some challenges involved, but it seemed as if that was quite a central focus in developing those relationships. And the second point on this slide is about the role of personalised support in overcoming barriers to learning. So I'd like to read out this quote from student 1 who sums it up really nicely. And they say, I feel so much a sincere will to help. Every teacher here was interested to invest in us and to help us. You cannot calculate this, but you can feel that you are important and people care. So we were really, really pleased to get that kind of feedback, to see the impact that our personalised support was having. Moving now to the next theme, theme 4, which is about agency and autonomy. So one of the main focuses on module 1 was in working on personal goals. So 8 of our students talked about how beneficial it was to work on the personal goals. And the students also talked about how important it was to them to have future educational plans. And I'd like to read this quote from student 10 who says, one of the positive effects of this program is on my mental health. It helps me to overcome stress and anxiety of fearing of your future. It also gives me a lot of energy to hope for my future education plan in the UK. So yeah, so we were you know, we realized the impact that this had on the students when we got that kind of feedback. So as well as having a lot of benefits, we also had some challenges, as Alex mentioned. One of the main challenges on module 1 was with independent study. This was especially challenging for cohort 1. So the students weren't always completing their tasks that we had built into the program. And there were various reasons, such as maybe they didn't fully understand what was the purpose of independent study. They found some of the tasks difficult and they were finding it challenging to balance their own lives, work, childcare, and so on with the demands of the course as well. So next slide, please. So we realized that we had to make some changes to that because it wasn't quite working the way that it was. So we discussed it with the tutors and asked about, should we drastically reduce the amount of independent study? Should we make some major changes to it? But the tutors still believed in the benefits of independent study. For example, tutor 1 said it would be doing the students a disservice to take this element of the course away because it is such a vital part of higher education. So we spent a bit of time thinking about how to manage it a bit better. So we scaffolded it more thoroughly and we put more emphasis on it in our induction sessions. And with the changes that we made, we got some positive feedback from the tutors who had taught on both iterations of the module, and they saw that with cohort 2, the students were engaging much more and had a much better sense of the expectations around independent study. Okay, and we'll move now on to the impact on tutors. So our first theme regarding the tutors is with developing the importance of developing relationships and the community of practice. So all of our tutors talked about what a positive experience it was to work with our students. They all mentioned things about being enjoyable, rewarding, fulfilling. They really respected the students and how much work the students put in and how the students shared their ideas and how much they learned from the students. And one of our tutors, tutor 5, talked about how they hoped that these students would impact HE, and they say, it makes me hopeful that these students may go on to provide much needed diverse perspectives in HE or how we see HE. And moving to the next slide. So as well as positive relationships with the students, our tutors talked about the positive experience of working with other colleagues on the programme, especially in terms of shared values. So the importance of the social justice element was quite strong among our tutors. And they talked about having the values, similar values to their colleagues, and how inspiring it was to work with other colleagues who shared the same types of values. And in terms of developing a sense of community and a community of practice, the tutors mentioned a lot about how it was a very supportive team and about how it was a very strong and positive tutor community that they were part of, and that they felt supported by the whole team as well. All right, so moving now to our next theme regarding the tutors, which is about reflection and trauma-informed pedagogy. So the tutors talked about how their involvement on the programme had impacted their teaching practice, both within teaching on refugee and in teaching on other contexts. So for example, tutor 1 said, I think I'm a little more flexible, a little more open to students' difficulties. I think my students generally benefit from my involvement in refugee. And other tutors mentioned about feeling like they had become a better practitioner, and tutor 3 mentioned the importance of the teacher training and in the pedagogies to work with refugee background students that they had not come across when working in having teacher training in other contexts. All right, and I think this is the final slide about impact on tutors. So it was also really important that the tutors had space and time for reflection. So they talked about how the reflection really helped them to engage properly with the trauma-informed pedagogy, and that they maybe wouldn't have engaged as well if they hadn't had that space and time to reflect. And they so we had regular tutor meetings where we discussed what's going well, what things we can improve on, any tricky situations. So the tutors really appreciated the chance to share their practice with our community. And moving on now, so this is our final slide, excuse me, about our key insights. So we'll start with a quote from the Connected Learning in Crisis Consortium, which we think really encapsulates what we were trying to achieve. So for refugee learners, learning begins where there is a connection. So this is quite, I feel like we've got a lot of overlaps with what Gabi was saying. So our first insight was about what we called disconnection forces. And Gabi had described it as being a life load. So our students were dealing with a lot of issues such as things like housing, illness, balancing the course, with other things going on in their lives. So we had some students who just were not able to continue with us, and we had some issues with absence and dropout. And sometimes it just was not possible for the students to remain in the course. However, we had quite a few examples of where there were students who were struggling, but they were able to remain on the course. And we think it's really because of our supportive relationships and the flexibility that we provided. So the students really appreciated the support and the flexibility. And as Alex mentioned, we had Julie working with us, who was our dedicated admin colleague, and she followed up on issues and absences and always reached out and tried to help the students. And we also had a lot of support from our partner organisation, Refugeedom, who were able to support us with caseworkers and with other resources. So in terms of teachers, I have to say we had an amazing group of teachers, and they put so much time and effort into the course, not only through teaching, but keeping the reflective logs and giving us feedback and then helping us to evaluate things. So we had a really strong sense of community, and I do think it was really strengthened by our shared values, and then the fact that we were quite a small group and we had regular meetings and a chance to discuss how things were going, and the teachers really appreciated that as well. And in terms of our syllabus and course, like Alex mentioned, we kind of felt there was a tension between having flexibility and giving choices, and the students as partners approach we felt was a very important element of our course, but we needed to be very careful with how we scaffolded things to not overwhelm our students. In terms of pedagogy, I think a key finding was that it was really important to have the time and space for training. So not only to do the training, but a time to reflect and to engage with it in practice as well. So I think we can sum it up by saying that we find it effective to employ the connected learning and crisis principles and put a greater emphasis on trauma-informed pedagogy to put relationships and connections at the heart of the course. So that's, I think that brings us to the end, but just to mention, we did collect a lot of data and we have a lot of other findings that we hope to share in future presentations or in future writing. So here's our reference list. I think we've got 2 more slides, Pascal, of the reference list. And then on the final slide, we've got some further resources if anyone's interested in following up on those. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ladies. So if you're interested in further resources and also trauma training, this is something that Alex offers at the University of Leicester. So you've got some links here, but we will share the slides later. And so now we're going to have a 5-minute break. And so right now it is at 5 to 11. So we will be back at 11 for our last talk, and then there will be an opportunity to ask questions to the chat and have some conversation. Thank you. Welcome back. So we will now move on to our next talk. Let's check that. Yeah, everybody's back.
Can you hear me, Pascal? Yes?
Yes, I can. I couldn't see you, so I was just like, wait a minute.
No, I'm here. I'm here.
Over to you, Gula.
Thanks very much, Pascal. I'm very delighted to be here, and thank you so much for inviting me to join the Refugee Week celebrations at the University of Leicester. And I'm just to start by saying that I'm Gula Haridonos. I'm based at the Open University. I'm a senior lecturer in the Institute of Education and Technology, and I have a very strong interest in refugee education. I'm also working in the Sanctuary Advisory Network in the university, where we are trying to become a university of sanctuary. So it has been very insightful to hear from Gabi, Alex, and Deidre about their work. And you all refer to the importance of social connections and relations for engagement with refugee students. And this is the thread I'm going to be following on here. So over the next 20 minutes or so, I aim to offer some reflections on the importance of relationships and connections in our work with students from refugee backgrounds. And I will situate this within a program of activity in my own institution, which is the Open Futures Sanctuary Program. Next slide, please. So the inspiration for this talk really comes from a recent book that Dr. Karen Gravet has published precisely on this matter of relations, connections, and mattering within learning and teaching. And very briefly, Karen views these three aspects as fundamental to learning and teaching and how we experience our work as educators. She refers to this interwoven web of relations, which is about the entanglements of human bodies, objects, spaces, and materialities in teaching and learning. And she also touches upon this concept of mattering in a way that I thought it was very interesting. So mattering, she says, is about how we feel we are valued by others. In other words, who and what matters in this web of relations, but also matter in the sense of the material substance, the spaces, the objects, the things of education, including books, pencils, desks, chairs, and all these mundane things that we tend to really ignore as background in our education work. So drawing on Gravet's work, and please next slide, I'm going to try to frame our work with students from refugee backgrounds through this lens. And I argue that we need to take into account of how objects, bodies, materialities really impact upon learning, teaching in connection to this particular group. And we tend to really highlight and foreground human relationships in our work. And this is of course very important. And I'm not going to say that human to human relationships are not significant, but it is about placing human in relation to those other elements, because our relationships are really embedded and are influenced within the spaces, within the context, within the environments within which they occur. And they have histories, but also may have futures. So it is about these relations we have within this material world and about the relationships that our students have. And the question that I'm kind of like thinking, and I have put here in the slide, is how do we connect to students from refugee backgrounds? And especially because I'm based at a distance university, we are presented with opportunities, but also additional challenges. So it's about how we connect meaningfully and how we create these meaningful connections with them at a distance. And I think this question is very important for many colleagues in this call, that maybe experimenting, maybe trying connected learning, digital learning in context of forced displacement. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next slide. And I would like to give you some information about the program. So the Open Future Sanctuary Scholarships Program, it's a relatively new development, a very hopeful development at the Open University, which provides scholarships to students from refugee backgrounds. It was launched in 2022, and it's structured around 3 strands of work, which is on the next slide, Pascal. So we have a strand which is supporting students on undergraduate studies. There is a strand which is about students on a pre-university program, which at the OU we call Access Program. And also we have a strand which is a pathway to postgraduate studies, which is led by King's College London. So my talk is really looking at the first 2 strands of work. And as part of this program, myself and many other colleagues have been involved in a scholarship project, which really looked at the first cohort that we had in the Open Sanctuary program. And this is the next slide, Pascal. So we were examining transitions to distance and online higher education with students from refugee backgrounds. We really wanted to understand these transitions, especially because in the literature, transitions tend to be presented as very linear processes. And of course, because this was a new strategic program at the university, part of our work was to offer recommendations to the university to inform strategic planning. And we have focused on 3 key stakeholders in our work, which had a strong interest in this program. These were colleagues at the senior management level, because the work sits within the Access and Participation program, but also within the EDI and developments in the institution. We also have groups of colleagues who we call as delivery team, as operational team, and they were involved in the everyday practicalities and really logistics of how to run this program. But there was also the focus on students themselves. And we followed a range of approaches. Can we move to the next slide, please, Pascal? Which were informed by ethnographic approaches and included lots of meetings, as you can imagine, with various stakeholders. As in these 3 groups, as I said, we had repeated interviews with students in 2 key moments of the year. We had interviews with tutors and advisors who were working directly with students. There were also EAP monthly events we organized for students, but also a range of other events and workshops that we ran that really fed into the development of the program and fed into how data were generated. So in what comes next, I'm going to offer some examples from interviews with students and also interviews with tutors, which really help unpack this notion of relationships, connections, and mattering, as I explained in the beginning of my talk. And just to say at the outset that it is quite work in progress. We are looking at the data through this lens. So I'm trying to lay out some thoughts really here about how this framing really supports stronger understanding about our work. So let me start with the first point of contact really with the institution, which was really the application form that students had to do. So students had to fill in a form and submit it online. Some students said that it was very easy. It included very rational questions, and it was perceived well, especially because of not having to walk to the post office to post the form, as the first student is saying here. But for other students, this paperwork and these forms really made them scared, as the second student is saying. So students really face lots of questioning in their lives. There are questions about immigration status. There were questions about why to study in this course. So, and I'm not saying, I think that these questions are very well intentioned. They serve the shortlisting process, but the fact remains that they made students scared and anxious. And we need to keep in mind that students have to fill in forms all the time, and they are always in search of proof of this material documentation, really, of their histories, of their status, of prior studies, of prior work experience, of English language certificates. And I think what this framework really offers is really placing our attention on noticing such things and noticing how these materials and how these processes we have in place really affect emotions and really affect the connection to the institution. And by noticing them, maybe we can change some of the practices, maybe we can change some of the questioning as well in relation to the students. Can we move on to the next slide, Pascal? When it comes to equipment, as you see in the first quote, the OU provided the laptop, provided the printer, provided this internet connection to the student, and it was a great relief, as he said. It was this material provision was really part of the package the students on the undergraduate courses had from the university. This was not the case for the students on the Access program, though. As you can see in the second quote, students on the Access program, as the student here, they were eligible, but they had to fill in a form. They had to apply for this support. So some of the students in our interviews, they said that they were not aware of this provision until very later in the term, when their tutors actually realized that they were studying, they were navigating things predominantly on their mobile phone, or they had to borrow laptops from friends. And similar to the examples I shared previously with the forms, the process that the institution had in place made some students scared. So in the case of this student, she had to go to the bank, apparently. She had to give evidence. She had to submit invoices. So in the end, she decided not to go for this. So, and I think in the case of the student, she had support from her host family. She was Ukrainian, and she probably could manage without this support from the institution. But this is not the case for all our students. And again, noticing these things makes maybe is going to prompt us and encourage us to change some of our practices. And I'm very happy to say that this process has actually changed in the meantime in my institution. But choices we make as institutions really matter, and create inclusions and create exclusions at the same time. So some students were able to benefit and participate more meaningfully in the spaces that were created by my institution. Others possibly were not. So moving to this idea of the digital spaces and tools, and these tools, these spaces that we're creating in our institutions, they really represent institutions' expectations and priorities we have for our students. So at the OU, a model we have in our student support teams and also in the Access program particularly is for tutors to use phone calls. And we have tutorials that are happening over phone calls, one-to-one tutorials. And of course, we are not formally using tools such as Zoom or WhatsApp with our students. This is not the institution's policy. So, and we have noticed and we have seen that especially after the pandemic, students have very strong preferences about platforms to use. And this, as I said, they are not always well aligned with institutional policies, but these platforms are really tools that connect us with one another. And without this, especially at a distance university, our online relationships cannot happen. And I think what we can see in this code and the point that the student is making about having a face-to-face call is that these tools, and again, choices we make, trigger actions. So this student is speaking about, is referring to actually speaking to a member of staff in the student support team without a camera. And this was repeated, actually. He made this comment in the second interview as well. So this was kind of like repeated in his experience. And if we have calls without cameras, especially one-to-one call, this really physically affects your body and how we experience these moments, as it is quite evident in this code. So engaging with someone on a call or online in a virtual space, it could be exhausting. And our bodies shift in response to whether we know who we're talking to, whether we have a face in front of us. He talks about having someone who smiles, having a smile in their face and actually meaning well, and knowing that actually this person can see us and they can see us as a person. So all this, I'm just highlighting this because all these things really matter and shape our relationships and learning experiences. And I'm going to give a final example from students' interviews, which really refers, I think it relates very much to Gabi's presentation, but also Alex and Deidre's presentation about flexibility. And when it comes to assessment, we see in this code that the student was struggling. He didn't even want to open the laptop. And it was quite fascinating to see in the data these instances where actually students were expressing feelings in relation to their devices, the devices that they were using. So I don't want to open my laptop anymore, because this signals an entry to those institutional spaces that the student is not feeling comfortable with. So he texted the tutor called him back immediately, and this apparently made a huge difference to the student at this time that he needed it. The tutor was not fixated to timelines. She granted the extension of 2 weeks, and she said, let's speak when you're back, and let's see how I can support you and give you more ideas. She's not asking for additional proofs. She's not asking for medical certificates. And she's trusting the student that the student is really struggling. And this mattered in their relationship. And of course, they had a history because they knew each other. They were working together since the beginning of the year. And really trusting the student is key. And these moments really matter on how our students engage with us and with our institution. Moving to a few examples from tutors and advisors. And I think lots of the evidence that were generated really referred to very established practices and routines that tutors and advisors engaged in. And of course, it's very important to have these routine practices. And tutors were engaging through a variety of means, like text messages, calls, emails, a combination of these. They were catching up with the student. They were going through assignments, especially, and really unpacking the questions and really supporting the students in developing skills as well. And so all these routines were very evident in the interview. But what we saw in the data is also really practices that are very strongly oriented to practices of care. And again, the previous talk also touched upon that. So moving to the next slide, Pascal. So students really matter to the tutors. I have to say that tutors nominated themselves to work within this program. There was an open call at the university for tutors who wanted to participate and really work with refugee students. So tutors had really strong motivations, and they felt that this was rewarding to them in so many ways. I think similar to what Deidre was just talking about. I think you shared a quote, Deidre, which was about someone said that you are really important, and people here are very, tutors made the students feel that they're very important and people care. So actually this fact about, this is the idea of mattering. So to make students understand that they matter to you, that they feel valued, that they've been listened to, and this and do this practically through how some practices that they are developing and how they connect to students. And the next example is actually a very practical example of how this tutor was offering this support. And he said that he's plugging people into their local amenities. So this person is very careful and very attentive to the material circumstances that the students were situated in. So in the second quote, you might see that he talks about the space being cold because the student couldn't afford to have the heating on. So he was aware of that. He was aware of the material circumstances that the student was placed. He's talking about the student not having food and not having income in their table, and really directing the student to food banks and agencies in their locality that he could get support from. In the first case, he recognized that the student didn't have any financial issues, but she was a newcomer in the UK. It was in Northern Ireland in this case, and she was feeling lonely, and she needed to connect to social groups in their locality, and actually understanding her interests and really understanding how he could support her in actually directing her again to local groups that could support with the social engagements. So it's these digital interactions that they had, which were actually steered towards the physical spaces in the students' local environment. And finally, I would like to make a note about, and that's the next slide, Pascal. I would like to make a note about the spaces that we are creating for our staff, for the educators, to really speak about their emotions and learn from one another. And I think this is an aspect that has received much less attention in our work. It was a great example what Deidre and Alex shared, that you had these regular meetings, tutors could speak, they could share reflections about practices. I have to say that this is not an aspect that, in the data at least, we didn't really see much evidence about this happening in my institution. And I'm mindful that this might have changed in the meantime, but I'm just referring to what we have seen in the evidence that was collected. So this quote that actually this person is sharing has stayed with me since the time that I did this interview. You know, what do you do with the stories? And it's very powerful. And I think having spaces where we can talk about stories, we can talk about emotions, we can talk about our responses to that, and really forging connections and discussions about care. And I think we refer a lot about safe spaces. Sometimes, I think, Gabi, you talked about that, mainly about our students, but I think we need these spaces for our staff and that are working directly with students. And I think because we are at a distance university, and I think this person is also making a comment, I mean, am I writing this on a forum? Because there was a forum actually for tutors to post comments. And of course, this was not very appealing to her. I think it's quite challenging to develop these relationships at a distance when you don't really have the physical and the visual cues to guide this engagement. But if we want to talk about care, and I think there are lots of discussions in the sector about care right now, it's really about realizing that, yes, there are practices that are oriented towards care, but also realizing that care work has implications for our tutors and it's affecting them. And it's really about understanding how educators, how students' relations are really entangled with care. And, you know, this affects their everyday practices and everyday life of our staff as well. So to conclude, I started this presentation saying that it is really maybe move on to the next slide, Pascal, because I know we're running out of time. I started this presentation by saying that it is really important to place our attention to relationships and material circumstances and connections with our students. In my case, this view has informed lots of the work that I have been doing, but in this particular study, it's quite fascinating to see how actually this is reflected in the data that were gathered. And it brings into the fore these material aspects of learning and teaching, which are very often overlooked, and we don't really think of them as significant. So I think this lens really helps us to consider our practices, to consider areas of change, changes that we need to make really to understand how these activities, how these situations really matter to our students' experiences in the university. And I think relational pedagogies and mattering really help us to surface these micro moments of learning and teaching that really matter, that are very important, and really reveal these gestures and practices that matter and create more affirmative spaces in higher education for students that may be coming from more disadvantaged backgrounds. So I would like to finish by please asking you to please share the call. In a couple of weeks out, we have the call about the next cohort of our Sanctuary scholarships. If you know of people who are looking for opportunities to study, there will be scholarships available at the OU. Please also visit this virtual space that we have created on the Open Learn platform, which is the Sanctuary Hub, where there are lots of resources curated that are tailored to the needs of students from refugee backgrounds. And if you're interested in this study, there is a report that has been published, and you can find it in our repository system. I would also like to thank my colleagues who have been involved in this work. This is not my own work. There have been many colleagues who have participated, and you can see them in this slide. This is really a huge thanks to the colleagues who appear here. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Kula. Actually, everything you said really aligned with my experience supporting refugee background students, not just distance learning, but also on campus and even beyond, I would say, international students in some cases around isolation, loneliness, the importance of knowing someone that you matter to someone. And so that rings very true. And I'm sure the same for my colleagues in the room. All right, so now it's time for our Q&A. So if you have any questions, please pop them into the chat, and Alex will actually be leading on the questions. So I will pass over to her.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Kula, and thanks, Pascal. We have a question already. That was quick, Hina. Okay, first question is, was the use of mattering purposeful from the OU? And if so, what led it to use mattering?
Hina, do you mean whether we started the study by thinking about mattering? I think you cannot have your mic on. I think we come from kind of like our work, myself and colleagues, is really informed by this idea of social materialities, material approaches to learning. So I have used these approaches in previous work myself, but I wouldn't say that actually we started the study with thinking about mattering. And it was actually, if you go to the report, you're going to see that we're following a different model of actually how we present the data in that. But actually, in working through the data, it was very evident from the data that this, it was fascinating to see how they expressed themselves around the devices that they were using, around the spaces that they were using, around the, these expressions of emotions all the time, So it kind of like led ourselves to go to these ideas of mattering as described by Karen Gravett, but also Tara Fenwick, and really trying to use the lens to understand our data in a different way. I hope I'm answering your question.
Thanks, Paula. Yeah, I think so. Just going back to another comment that Hina mentioned before. So she was saying she likes the use of mattering rather than belonging. So I think it was that the choice between which one of those to focus on. I think that was what the question was centered around. Yeah, so Hina has now mentioned in my role we talk a lot about belonging, and we're beginning to move towards using mattering as a more appropriate word, as it shifts the onus from the student to the institution. Okay. Paula, you have another question, this time from Gabi Witthaus. So did the OU tutors know which students were sanctuary scholars? In my case, they didn't for data protection reasons. I wonder if this knowledge would affect the staff-student relationship.
They knew, Gabi. There was, so as I said, especially in the Access program, there was a call out for tutors to actually nominate themselves to work with students. But the Access program at the OU is quite unique. It's a unique model of tutorials and provision, really, which is more one-to-one. And also because most of the students on the Access program, they come from disadvantaged groups. So our tutors are quite used and accustomed to work with students from these backgrounds. There was an email actually, and this was an instance in the data where there was a tension. There was an email that went out to all the tutors saying that you're working with students, individual tutors, and this student is from refugee backgrounds. Some tutors actually missed that email. So we had a few tutors who came back to us when we were inviting them to interviews to say, but I actually didn't know that my student was from a refugee background. So there were some tutors who were not aware. And actually in the system that the OU has, the tutor system where the tutors access information about students, they could only see that the student was on a scholarship, but they didn't know why they were on a scholarship, really. So for tutors who missed that information in the very early stages of the academic year, there was no way that actually they could find out afterwards unless they were inquiring with student support teams.
Thanks, Kula. Can I respond to that?
Yes.
Okay. I think it's a really interesting question because at Leicester, at the case study that I focused on, the students, the sanctuary scholars were just a part of the, they were just integrated into the distance student body. And I think there are positives and negatives to that, because on the one hand, there's no sort of special attention drawn to their status. On the other hand, when they did need sort of understanding, there was at least one student who felt he wasn't getting it from a tutor. I think subsequently that program changed the way they worked so that the director of the program, who had processed all their applications and had prior communication with all of them, was allocated all those students as, and she became their tutor. So there was already a prior relationship and understanding there. But I think it's difficult. It's something that needs to be considered when you are opening up a mainstream distance learning program to sanctuary scholars. So my thinking here is, should special care be given to a certain category of students? I mean, we know that so many students have experienced trauma or are going through really difficult circumstances. And eventually, I think in the long run, we need to develop a culture that really permeates the whole university, not just the academics working with the students. There was one student in my study as well who dropped out because she couldn't get the help she needed from IT services to get her password problem sorted out. She just couldn't get back onto the virtual learning environment. And after about 6 months, she dropped out. And I think if they had known in IT services, or if there had been some kind of, I don't know, a training for them, but that it's difficult working in a huge institution with thousands of students and trying to implement this notion of care at scale.
Yes, I agree. And I agree that it should be, for me, it should be embedded within the institutional practices and structures. I think we know, Gabi, that students have additional needs. Many of the students, especially from refugee backgrounds, and not just from refugee backgrounds, have additional needs. They need support. So we have seen, at least in the evidence that were gathered, I mean, we had these personal learning advisors assigned to our students on the full scholarship programs. And actually these advisors who were working with lots of other students from disadvantaged backgrounds, they said that students didn't need support, and on one hand, you're thinking, are we taking the whole service away from these students, Because maybe in the case of that particular first cohort, yes, there were students that they didn't need so much support in terms of the cognitive, the epistemological aspects of study, how to study. They were perfectly capable of doing that. But at the same time, there were students who really needed this type of support. So I think it's valuable to have these systems in place and probably assess them at regular points, and if you think that they are not needed because the students don't feel that they need the support, or they are perfectly capable of moving on with their studies, then we kind of like adjust them and adapt them at regular times in our academic year, isn't it? Rather than just removing everything because we had this data. Yeah, not sure. I think practices of care, I think we tend to think of them as very positive, which they are very positive. But at the same time, as I said, I think there is lots of inequalities associated with practices of care. And I think colleagues at UCL, Eileen Kennedy published a study recently, which was about the emotional labor, especially for women, isn't it, to practice care. So I think we need to be mindful of all these implications that are associated with practices of care, and also the systems within which we are working, that they don't really value these practices, or there is no recognition of whether tutors are spending hours and hours of actually supporting students.
And
It's really
experiencing vicarious trauma, like you mentioned earlier. Yeah, I agree with you.
So it's less about the individuals having, I mean, it is a responsibility that we should all have. And I think if we change systems in our institutions, they will benefit more groups of students. I tend to think that, making our systems and our structures and our practices more inclusive is not just for the benefit of refugee students, it's for the benefit of everyone. But it's also really trying to change these systems that are actually imposing certain practices that are driven by other metrics, and other motives in higher education sector.
Thanks.
Great, thank you, Kula and Gabi. And I guess that relates to what Gabi was talking about earlier in terms of the capabilitarian approach, and how it's not just about somebody's own skills and abilities, but it's also about the structures which are kind of enabling or hindering people when it comes to putting these things into practice. So yeah, okay, so we have a few more questions that have come into the chat box. We have a question from Deirdre for Kula. Kula, you're getting all the questions at the moment.
Yes.
So it's about, so apart from having regular meetings for tutors, do you have any other thoughts about how best to support tutors with what they do with student stories?
It's a question that I keep thinking, Deirdre, to be honest. The tutors themselves were, of course, talking about training, and talking about, one of the things that we haven't done particularly well, I think, at the OU was really embedding these ideas of trauma-informed practice. But I think tutors themselves were saying that they would like to also meet experts in this field, and have like contacts with them. So bringing someone who is an expert on trauma-informed practice actually, and talking to them. I think that there is this fear that you don't know enough, and maybe you're doing something wrong in this engagement with students. So yes, I think it's an ongoing discussion actually. I think maybe we need to collectively consider what could be the spaces that we're creating for students and staff. And I also tend to think that people in different roles have different needs. So tutors who are working directly with students, maybe maybe they need more about trauma-informed practice or about the pedagogical approaches. But colleagues who are in student support teams or academic services, maybe they need something more about the legalities, about what does it mean to be a refugee or an asylum seeker, because I think we realize that colleagues have lots of lack of awareness around these things as well. So it's really thinking about these spaces and more like tailored approaches for people in different roles in our institutions.
Okay, thanks very much, Kula. You'll be relieved to hear that the next question is for everyone and not just for you, Kula. Okay, this is a question from Apophia. So she asks, are second-generation refugees a focus in current research? For them, there may be a dichotomy of not being a refugee background student themselves, but they identify with the ongoing experience directly or indirectly of first-generation refugee background students, such as assisting to or carrying out admin, form filling, providing language or translation support, supplying social connections. Would second-generation refugee background students' engagement in learning in higher education have a similar dropout rate or require similar approaches, for example, trauma-informed or social justice approaches? Would anyone like to start to kick off with that one? I mean, I think Gabi has already started to answer that one in the chat, to say that in her view, second generation refugees are refugee background students. I mean, I would say the same thing when it comes to adopting trauma-informed approaches. And I think actually, I can't remember now, I think it was perhaps Kula who already said that, for example, when it comes to pedagogies of care, and just there's no harm in adopting a kind of institution-wide approach to that, because we don't know which students have experienced trauma, and so that's something that would benefit everyone. So that, in theory, that's kind of, I think, what we're trying to steer towards. However, I think it's already been mentioned that there is a kind of a bit of a knock-on effect of that in terms of emotional labour, and so we need to kind of make sure we put structures in place to support the carers, type of thing. But yeah, that's what I would say. I mean, would anyone else like to jump in on that one?
Can I speak about my personal experience here, Alex? I mean, I come from a family who were internally displaced. So back in Cyprus, where I'm coming from, I do have a status of refugee. So now in the UK, probably I don't count as a refugee, but I think it's what Gabi is saying in the chat box, that there is this intergenerational trauma. Trauma cuts through generations. Even though myself, I haven't experienced displacement myself, but this has been in the stories of my family for 50 years later. It's there, it's something that is in the memories, and it's in the, it has shaped who parents, uncles, everyone, and myself are. So I think that, yes, I would agree, second generation refugees are refugee background students. The issues at the moment, I don't think in the sector we have a way to actually record this in our systems. I mean, we realized when we started the sanctuary work at the OU that we actually have known data about who are refugees in the university. I think now, because we're in the process of trying to become a university of sanctuary, some of these systems or records are more accurate, mainly because through the scholarships program, but still it's not part of what, as an institution, we're required to report back to, Office for Students or other UK authorities. So I think it really, at the practical level, I would say that it goes down to how we define the second generation students, how we record them in our systems. And my guess is that we don't really have any data about the students at the moment.
Yeah, and that's been my experience as well. I think we don't even have accurate data necessarily about people who are kind of have experienced forced migration themselves and are currently, refugees, for example. We don't necessarily have absolutely accurate data, and I think that's something. I think there's some research that's being conducted by King's College London at the moment to try to kind of pin down how different organisations try to kind of record that information and how we can make it more accurate across the sector. Okay, so thank you for the question, Apophia. So I think we're going to move on now to Pascal's point. So Pascal, I mean, I could read this out, or perhaps you could unmute yourself and just say what you wanted to say verbally.
I've made a few points, so where are you at?
The thing about secondary trauma training and boundary setting and things like that.
Yes, happy to make that point. Yeah, it was going back to support for tutors. We support students from refugee background and, how they can deal with the stories and everything. That's definitely something I think we all struggle with at one point. Alex and I, when we started supporting students from refugee background, we actually did attend a training on secondary trauma, because when the students share traumatic experiences with you, so their trauma, you can, as a result, suffer from secondary trauma. So I think it's really important, to consider what you are actually able to cope with. It's important to be clear on what you can help with, what you're equipped to help with, and this might change over time as well, depending on on your life load as well, and that's something that is okay. And you need to know, you need to have boundaries. That's something one of our students who actually took part in our panel of discussion yesterday also mentioned, that a student who is from refugee background but has moved on to working for a charity that support people from refugee background. And he made the point of the importance of setting clear boundaries, because otherwise, particularly in his case, is himself someone from refugee background, is probably supporting his family, he's got his friends quite often from refugee background, and then as part of his work is supporting people from refugee background. And you can't do it all, and sometimes you just don't have like the strengths, or or sometimes you just don't have the skills or the knowledge to help them. So you need to know your limit, and if someone comes to you for help, you should listen. I think listening and showing them that you care is, as Kola mentioned, it is so important. I've seen the difference it can make in our students. But like, you also need to be able to say, okay, this is beyond what I can help with or cope with, and you need to know when you need to signpost those students to other services, whether within the organization or outside, or whether it's a GP or anything, who can support them better, are more equipped to support them. And you may sometimes need, to take breaks or to distance yourself a little bit, not abandon the student, because obviously, when you develop that relationship, they need you, but you need to be mindful of your own mental health and what you can deal with, and share with colleagues if you need to an extent, because obviously you also need to be mindful that the student, they might be things that they've shared with you that they don't want you to share with others. But like, yes, if you need help, you need to say you need help, because it can be a lot, and particularly when you're supporting a large number of students. I think over time, you know, it becomes more and more, and you get to a point where suddenly it's too much and you need to take a step back. I've definitely experienced that. I used to get very involved with the students, and at one point I was like, I need to take a step back and set clearer boundaries, and I can't be 24/7, you know, on call to help them, because it's starting to affect my own mental health life. So, but it is difficult when you care about them. It's really difficult.
Okay, thanks very much, Pascal. And I think we probably have time for one more question, which is Gabi Smallbone's question from the chat. She says, the program I'm working on and the one that I'm trying to organise, refugee background students join and will join existing cohorts. So can I ask the panel if they have any experience of training or support for those students prior to the start of the course? For example, supporting them in developing strategies to deal with situations or questions or get support. So this sounds like we've talked earlier about trauma training for staff. So this kind of sounds like it's kind of like turning it on its head a bit, and it's like training for the students themselves in strategies that they might be able to use if they're joining existing cohorts. So this suggestion is definitely not intended as a replacement for the care of students, but as an addition and a potential empowerment. So yeah, so that's a really interesting concept. Would anyone like to answer that one or share any thoughts about that one? Yeah, Gabi.
I had a thought actually, Alex and Deirdre, while you were talking, and I was thinking what you were presenting, although it was an EAP specific context, but all the work that you did on scaffolding students into independent learning, that would be so useful for all students, but particularly Sanctuary Scholars learning online. And I was actually going to ask you guys if you thought that there were opportunities to develop that into a more generic, like a foundation course, and then I don't know, it would be great to run that through, say, the universities of Sanctuary collaboratively. There might not be enough Sanctuary Scholars learning at a distance at any individual single university, but if we did it collaboratively, that might be a fantastic resource for students learning online for the first time, because I think the students in my study would really have benefited from that.
Yeah, maybe we can have a chat about that, Gabi, separately, maybe afterwards. But I'll just go back to what Gabi was saying about preparing those students to join an existing cohort. Maybe my thoughts are a bit generic and not really particularly about the existing cohort, but like you're just mentioned, Gabi, about the work that we put in kind of before students joined. One major change that we made from iteration 1 to iteration 2 was the first time we ran our module, we had an induction session, which was part of session 1. And then big learning curve, we realized we needed a lot more time to help students be prepared before the course actually started. So we changed it to an induction week with, you know, asynchronous and synchronous sessions, which was, you know, a week 0 before students even went near their first session, to set them up to have a one-to-one meeting to go through any issues they were having with accessing things, any problems they were having. So they had the opportunity to talk face-to-face to somebody. And like Kula, you were talking about the sense of fear about completing forms and things like that. So I think it's really beneficial to have a person to work through those things with them, and even other small things like having the students give feedback that, you know, we make little videos to show them, this is what your screen's going to look like. You need to click here, you need to click here, you need to open this like this. So just simple things like that, having videos that they can go back to and re-watch and kind of do things step by step. Yeah, so I'm not sure that I have anything in particular to say about joining an existing cohort, but maybe just given, like, make sure there's a lot of time to get ready and to practice things before actually starting. And yeah, having a very scaffolded approach to not throw students into the deep end, I suppose. as well. Yeah, probably takes a lot more time than you would maybe anticipate.
Okay, thanks to both of you. And I can see that Kula has mentioned in the chat that the Open Sanctuary Hub has a resource about learning to study online or being a learner online, which might be tailored to the OU, but it could be helpful to anyone. So yeah, that looks like a good thing to explore as well. Okay, thanks very much. So I don't think we have any more questions in the chat. So I think it's about time to wrap up. So yeah, I don't know about you, but my mind is kind of buzzing all over the place, and it's a really good thing that this session was recorded, because I feel like I need to go back over it and and listen to it all again, and kind of make more detailed notes, because there's so many different leads to follow up on. So yeah, thank you so much to all of our speakers. It's been so valuable to actually take a deep dive into this topic and look at it from different angles and kind of see what the resonances are between the three presentations. So yeah, thank you so much, everyone.